Dear Professor Walker, I'm very glad that we're talking again. I was very happy to arrive to your site last October after all kinds of mishaps. It wasn't a pleasant journey, but in the end it paid off. So can you recap the season 2021? We all know that because of the pandemic, you were not able to travel and dig in 2020, and I think it was the first time that your team gathered after 2018. In 2018, I also came with the former assistant director, Jack Green, assistant director of ACOR, and we attended a small ceremony back in 2018. So after 3 years, what were the findings on the site?
Yeah, 2018 was our last season. Generally, we dig every 2 or 3 years. So we were planning a field season the summer of 2020. The pandemic made it impossible. Then we pushed it out for the fall, like everybody else, thinking things would be better in the fall. The fall of 2020, it still wasn't possible to travel. And then we made a decision to just make it happen in 2021. And we had a window of opportunity here, at least in Germany. So the key was to do it early enough in the fall before the winter colds set in, but late enough that everybody on the team could be fully vaccinated. And that was a university requirement. It made entry into the country, into Jordan, easier. Our entire team of workmen were vaccinated as well. So it's the only way to do a field season during a pandemic. And it was extremely difficult to get the paperwork, legal and mostly legal and health paperwork together here in Germany to get permission for our team to go. And keep in mind, it was 20 people. So 20 people in my team plus 12 workmen, 32 of us total. And most of the people on my team, with a few exceptions, were my own MA and a large number of my own PhD students. So with so many students from one university traveling, we had to make sure that everything was taken care of for health issues. I got to tell you, this was a very important field season for us because we are preparing for the final publications of the Islamic strata at Tel Hisban. This would include everything that was done from 1968 until today. Final report on everything of the medieval Islamic period and Ottoman period. Falls into one volume that I'll be authoring with a bunch of specialist reports. And it's a big project, but in order to get it done, we had a few open questions that we needed to answer, and we needed one more field season to do it. Now, once that final report is done and published, then we can come back and a new phase of field work. And there's a lot of things that I have planned for the future, but it was important to answer these final questions. And we were mostly interested in, well, you were there at the site. We have these clusters of vaulted buildings all over the slopes, up against the citadel wall, down the slopes, on the flatlands before it drops into the wadi. That was the medieval village. That was occupied from probably the Roman period through the Byzantine, early Islamic, Middle Islamic, and late. And those buildings are fairly well preserved. The problem is we didn't up to this point reach foundation levels in an entire complex enough to be able to say when these things are built, how they change, when are they resettled. And there was a picture that I was getting from other field projects I have, as well as field work that's been done across southern Bilad Hasham, that we do have a break in permanent occupation at many sites that were established in the late antique, early Islamic period. And then what seems to be a rather sudden resettlement of some of these ruined places a couple hundred years later in the 13th century. And what we found this season is that is indeed the case. It's a late Ayyubid reoccupation of the old Byzantine early Islamic site. So we wanted this season to accomplish that much, to be able to take one farmhouse cluster and be able to document from the time those buildings are built, how do they expand over time, when are they abandoned, when are they resettled, to get a whole life history of what really is housing for an extended family, and to be able to tell that story. We also wanted to get a full plan of the site, which we were able to do through photogrammetry, 3D modeling, and ground penetrating radar, which we did with earnest for the first time in 50 years at the site across the slopes. And it was one of my PhD students from the University of Kiel that did that work with Yarmouk University. We also wanted to be able to confirm a couple of other things, to be able to stratigraphically separate coursewares from the Middle and Late Islamic period, and we're in the process of doing that. To see, we had evidence in previous seasons of local ceramic production at the site, but not just coursewares. Really fine glazed wares, wheel-made wares are made at Hisban as well, and we now have concrete evidence of this, of the production facilities at the site. So these are, and the final issue then is related to the botanical record and understanding what people cultivated, how cultivation practices changed, how people's food preferences may have changed and why. And there's very interesting stories to be told about why people change how they cook and what they're eating and what they're feeding their families over the course of the Ayyubid-Mamluk and Ottoman periods. And at the end of that 3-week season, I think we can all say, all 20 of us that were part of that team, that we walk away with a sense of real satisfaction for having accomplished what we wanted to. Specific questions, carefully selected methodology to answer those questions, and now we're working through all of the data for those publications now.
Who are members of your 2021 team? When I came to the site, I saw the variety of scholars from different universities and different countries. It was like a small UN gathered at Tel Hisban.
Well,
although you don't look like Ban Ki-moon.
It would take a long time to name them all, but they're all up on our website. All but just a handful of my PhD students were there. Some of them were actually doing fieldwork in other parts of Jordan at the time and couldn't join us at Hisban. I have PhD students that are art historians that were in other countries working on their dissertations, but the bulk of my PhD students were there. 2 of my MA students were there, 2 of our Erasmus students who had been with us at my research unit studying Islamic archaeology from a university in Istanbul and a university in the UK. They were with us. We had various specialists. Warren Schultz from DePaul University did our numismatics, as he has for many, many years, and will prepare the coins for publication. Megan Perry from East Carolina University is our bioarchaeologist, and she got us started on the excavation of the Cis tombs in the North Church that are medieval, and she will be doing now post-season the study of health and the isotope analysis of the bones to tell us where people came from in the 13th century. We had Bob Bates from Andrews University that got us set up with IT and developed our digital data collection system and helped us install our flotation machines. Alan Farahani in Nevada was unable to join us because of an injury in the field, but we had meetings with him about sampling and flotation strategies the whole season. And he is working now on the postseason sampling, processing of all of the soil samples for macrobotanical analysis. Another person that was not in the field with us, but is now here in Bonn with us at the research unit is Sofia Laparidu, who is our phytologist specialist and has been for many years. She has a Marie Curie fellowship and she's now staying with us in-house at the University of Bonn for the next 2 years. So it was a really, really rich group. And as far as the PhD and MA students are concerned, they come from Jordan, Syria, Poland, Italy, the US, Germany. Who am I forgetting?
You forgot
I
Walter.
have, what's that?
Walter Schultz.
Yeah, Professor Schultz. Well, that was our
Professor
new
Schultz
music
was with you, and I'm preparing a series of articles about his research in Mamluk fiscal policy and numismatics.
He has wonderful stories to tell about the
Yes.
medieval economy based on the coins, and mostly copper coins. So
True.
small change. Yeah.
Can you tell more about the publication that you're preparing?
Okay, so the this is a final volume that goes into the Hisban series published by Andrews University Press, and they published the Phase 1 Heshbon expedition volumes from the 1970s. But the Islamic material was never published in final form. The pottery was for the 70s, but never the stratigraphic reports. So I'll be publishing the old material from the 60s and 70s, plus everything we've done from 1998 until now. And that will be everything from Umayyad period all the way through the Tanzimat, including British Mandate, will go into this volume. And it will be a story of the history of the site. It will incorporate all the specialist reports, including the pottery that I'm working on right now, laboratory analysis that my students are doing. That will go into the final report. But then we want to keep in mind that I have 18 PhD students, and many of them are working with Hisban material. So in the next few years, you're going to see a series of doctoral dissertations come out of the University of Bonn that make use in one way or another of the material culture of Jordan. And much of it is material from our Hisban excavations. And those dissertations will be in English. There are likely to be some MA theses that come out too. Now in Germany, a doctoral dissertation has to be published for you to get your PhD. So these dissertations will be available to people and they will be published, which is very nice.
You were also dealing with cemetery in the North Church, which is
right
on the footholds of Tel Hisban.
Right.
Can you tell a few words about the cemetery in the North Church?
You know, in over 50 years of excavation, we found the Byzantine cemetery was identified, the Roman cemetery was identified, but we never found the full cemetery of the site for the Islamic period, except for individual graves. And in '98, I was part of the team that excavated the Bedouin cemetery on the summit that is 19th century, but nothing in between. In 1978, John Lawler, an American archaeologist who was tied to the Heshbon expedition, he did the initial excavation of part of the North Church in order to get a plan. And that's when the mosaics were uncovered, and the mosaics some of them were removed, not all of them, and put in the Madaba Museum. You can see them in Madaba today. What slowed down that work is that on the north end of the church, in the north aisle, and also in the apse of the church, were some 70 to 80 stone-cut cist burials. So these were individual burials that have stones, they're outlined with stones, and they have stone covers. There are practically no burial goods, but in the soil on top of the graves was pottery. And there were bowls that were buried with the individuals that were laid on the mosaic floor of the apse. And at that point, the work stopped. There were just, you have a mass cemetery. What do you do with it? All that John Lawler could say at the time is that the associated pottery was Mamluk. This looks like this was a Mamluk reuse of a church that had been out of use for hundreds of years. So this Byzantine church continued to be used for worship into the early Islamic period, into probably the early Abbasid period, and then stopped and wasn't used again. And then in the Mamluk period, it's cleaned out and it's used for burials. But no work was done with those burials. No work was done with the church again until 2018. Then Daryl Roll, who is now at Calvin College, went back to finish John Lawler's plan and to check his plan of the church, which meant putting in some limited trenches to see where the walls are. And again, he hit, in the south part of the church, the south aisle started to hit more graves. And the stop work came to a stop. Stop, uncover the mosaic pavement, you get the plan of the church, and that's it. Well, now we decided then for the subsequent season that we would do a very targeted study of a few of those graves, because we have this outstanding question, two questions actually. Is this the cemetery of Mamluk Hisban, which we've answered this season? Yes, it is, probably. The second question is, when did it start to be used and for how long? And most importantly, who are these people? Where did they come from, right? We're still not clear about religion.
Yeah.
It's quite possible they're Christian, yeah? There are no grave markers. There's no grave goods, with the exception, very little of anything. But the key to this is to look at how the bodies are buried, and also to do the isotope analysis of some of the skeletal remains. Because with strontium and oxygen analysis, you can tell where early in life the people that were there came from. And that's ultimately what we want to know, is when this site was resettled in the 13th century, who were these people? Were they local? Did they come from far away? That's an interesting story about migration and resettlement, and we want to understand that. And we can't get that from written sources. It's just, there's nothing there to help us. All right, so we excavated 5 of the burials, only 5, and the study is still ongoing, and we hope to have results within the next year. And again, Professor Megan Perry is doing that work on the analysis of the graves. Very important, though, is the dating. So we did get a coin, and Warren Schultz read that coin, and you can ask him about it when you do this interview with him. And that coin was indeed a very late Ayyubid coin, very specifically dated to the 1220s, and the coin was minted in Aleppo. Now, where does that coin come from? Soil directly on top of the cover of one of those graves. The soil that's on top of the graves is all 13th, 14th century pottery. This was a 13th century cemetery that continued to be used in the 14th century. That coin is important for another reason, because on the farmhouse cluster that you visited, we reached bedrock and we reached foundation levels and identified foundation trenches for the walls of those houses. And the pottery that's coming out of them is late Ayyubid. Now, we've taken charcoal samples. We'll get C14 dates, hopefully in the next few months. But everything is fitting together that it looks like it's a first quarter of the 13th century is when the site that had been largely abandoned since the Abbasid period is resettled again.
What caused the abandonment of the site? At Tel Hisban, we have a long history of different groups being present. We have Hisban in Bible. It's mentioned in the Old Testament as one of the sites where Israelites settled during the roaming in the Promised Land. Of course, biblical stories are not always accurate, and what many times historians and archaeologists are trying to find different clues and different evidence to prove these biblical stories, and Bible as a source is questionable to some extent. But since we don't have many primary sources, Bible and Quran and other religious books are better than nothing. I'm personally very skeptical towards religious books as a historical source, or even ancient scribes and ancient historians as relevant sources, because they didn't know the methodology and they were more or less biased. But do we have material evidence of their presence in Tel Hisban?
Okay.
We are talking about Iron Age. This is
Okay, so
another phase.
if you're talking
Yeah.
the pre-classical phases of occupation at the site, yes, there is pottery. We've got the standing architecture, the citadel wall seems to be of an earlier construction. And this goes back to the 1970s excavations, that there likely was an iron tube presence in the site, but that, and the wall around the site, different dates have been offered for that as being Iron II or Hellenistic.
Yeah.
What happens in the Roman period is that whatever was on top of the hill was demolished, and everything was shoved off the hill into what was left and what hadn't already been filled in the reservoir, right? Dumped.
Yeah.
So you don't have, and it's very typical construction. Face it, if you want a house or a building to be stable, you're going to build it on bedrock, right?
Yeah.
That means you've got to demolish what's there unless what's there can be reused. And that's very typical across the site. So yes, there is ceramic evidence, but what to make of that is still being debated, and what kind of site we have before the Roman period is up to debate, but there's something there. When you get to the post-Abbasid period, this is when things kind of get interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that there was a military conflict in the early Abbasid period at Hisban. We've got reference to this in an early Islamic chronicle in Arabic, and this has been published at different times by Don Whitcomb and others. And the reference goes this way, is that there is a conflict between what's left of the Umayyad family and the Abbasid family, and there's a standoff at Hisban. Now, whether that takes place at the Tell or somewhere else, that's not really clear. It likely happened at the Tell, because we do have what looks like not really so much a destruction level, but well, there's damage. There's damage to some architecture, and then we don't have any pottery really after the 9th and the 10th centuries. So I can say this much, is that the Tell is abandoned in the Abbasid period, and that most of the slopes, the summit is, and most of the slopes of the Tell are no longer used for permanent wide-scale occupation after the Abbasid period until the 13th century. We do have Fatimid pottery. We have C14 dates that are Fatimid. But what the pottery and the stratigraphy and the charcoal is telling us is that we've got a temporary use of some buildings for a short amount of time in the Fatimid period, and then it doesn't last. So people come back and visit the site. But in terms of permanent reoccupation, there isn't. Now, does that have to do with this conflict between the Umayyad and Abbasid family? Maybe. Does it have to do with the move of the capital from Damascus to Baghdad? Maybe. Don't really know. It's a pattern, by the way, that we see across the region, across southern Bilad Sham. And whether that's full scale of abandonment of places, or whether that's abatement of settlement, I think that that's something that we need to revisit. And many people are studying that from a ceramic perspective. I think what's more interesting than the abandonment is the resettlement. Why come back? That's an interesting question. And the archaeological record can tell us only so much. What we see at Hisban and what was confirmed this season is that this isn't just a sporadic resettlement, and it's not done by one group of people or one family. It's done site-wide, and it's happening at the same time. And a lot of the standing remains from the Byzantine and early Islamic period are simply reused. And so unlike earlier periods where you demolished a lot of stuff, it's a resettlement pattern that says that it's done quickly. You're reusing what's there. You're reviving, repurposing the things that are there. You're putting the roofs back on, you're clearing out the cisterns. And we see that pattern in many other sites across southern Syria too. So it points to a certain modality of resettlement that seems to involve large groups of people. It doesn't happen overnight, and more people come and the population grows. But initially there are multiple clusters of these buildings across the site that are resettled at the same time. And I think that that's important. Now the question is, of course, you're going to ask why? Why then? Why Hisban, and who are these people? And these are questions that we hope that our laboratory analysis is going to help answer. As far as why then, I have my own ideas based on work that I've done with texts, but not religious texts. The texts I'm working with are economic, the Waqf documents, tax registers, and also legal documents too, that indicates something very interesting that's happening over the course of the Mamluk period. And I wonder if this resettlement of the site and other sites like Hisban may not have something to do with something that the late Ayyubid and Mamluk states are doing to invest in rural areas, to encourage people to move. And the state may be forcing people to move. The Mamluks did this, the Ottomans did this. And I think that it's something we need to revisit by studying the text very, very critically, to see if we can reconstruct the political and economic environment of the 13th century to account for why people would move into these abandoned places and make them home. So long story short, I don't know yet, but I have ideas that we're hoping to.
It's interesting story how,
year.
How it was occupied, reoccupied, abandoned. Was the site abandoned during Tamerlan's campaign in Levant in early 15th century?
Yeah, we have much more evidence of damage to sites in northern Jordan than we do in this region. Mm-hmm. We've got lots of textual references to horrible things happening in villages in northern Jordan and people leaving, but then coming back. So they don't leave forever. They abandon villages for a while until Timur's forces leave, and then they come back. It seems not to have been such an issue this far south, because what I'm seeing in the early 15th century is simply continuity, abatement, but continuity of settlement. So if we were to talk about what is the life history, the biography of the village and then town of Hisban from the 13th to the 16th centuries, I think what you're going to see is this. You have an abandoned place that is resettled in the early 13th century, and it becomes a thriving village. In the early 14th century, now whether that's because of the state or something else, that remains to be seen. In the early 14th century, the Mamluk state makes the decision to make Hisban the capital of the Balqa, and it moves a small garrison to the top of the hill, and the castle is refortified and all of that. And then they have to move in all of these civil servants, right, to support it. There already was a kind of an urban infrastructure there. There was a market, there was a court and a qadi that had been there from the late Ayyubid period. But nonetheless, the population seems to really, really expand in the 14th century, and that's the boom period. You see that across Jordan. right? The 14th century is a peak, a demographic peak. Economically, times are good. Then you go through a third phase, and this is the late 14th into the 15th century, and slowly people move away. Not everywhere. At Hisban, we know there's a reason for that. There's an earthquake, and the state makes a decision to move the garrison to Amman and make Amman the capital, and they force the civil servants to relocate. The army relocates. A lot of the businessmen have to relocate, and they say many of the people of Hisban have to leave Hisban and relocate to Amman. That was a government decision. And then slowly, when the business disappears, people move away. Where are they going? What we see in terms of surveys is new sites emerge, but they're small. So there's a dispersal of settlement over the course of the 15th century. But I don't think that it has to do with Timor. I think that it has to do with things that are happening economically and politically within the Mamluk realm that just encourages a different distribution of settlement. And so you get the towns pay the price for the growth of new villages and farmsteads and hamlets and things like that. Now, if you want to call that decline, it's a decline of the town, but it's the growth of something new.
How Tel Hisban was significant for interregional trade with Syria? We know from historical sources that Syria was very important agricultural produce that they imported all the way to Palestine and Palestinian ports. It was some kind of granary of the region.
Yeah, it was a breadbasket. We can call the whole Mediterranean Plains a breadbasket of the ancient world. As you can see today, I mean, cereal production, diversified cereal production is a mainstay of the economy, and certainly was in the classical period and in the medieval period too. Jordanian cereals were, of course, they were taxed, and that tax money was used to support the military, and that was an important element of keeping the Mamluk state running. But in times of dearth and of famine, cereals from across southern Syria then were shipped either to Cairo or to Damascus to help starving urban populations get by. We do have a boom period in cereal production in the 14th century, and that's reflected in textual sources, but it's reflected in the botanical record too, where we've got intensified and diversified production of cereals. But then we've got another boom in the 18th century too, and 18th, 19th century, when the flour, you've got the qusur that are built. These are basically fortified granaries, if you want to call them that are constructed in the Wadi Hisban. But we have photos of that. The Palestine Exploration Fund in London has this. They are, there's a lot of cereal production of wheat, that is controlled by large landowning entrepreneurs, not by the state, by landowners, large landowners in the Wadi Hisban. And at some point then in the 19th century, when flour and cereal production and export gets disrupted in places like the United States, for example, for the Civil War, cereals that are produced in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, and that includes Jordan, are shipped to the coasts and then sent other places. So I would say that this area, particularly the Madaba Plains as a whole, really becomes extremely important for the post-classical period in the 14th and in the late 18th, early and the 19th centuries, the 19th century in particular.
Regarding your research in October last year, what kinds of conclusions you came to with regards to a diet of occupants of or inhabitants of Tel Hisban? You and your students were studying the diet and culinary recipes and actually gastronomy of that time, if I have to say so. I don't know how their diet was developed at that time, but what kinds of conclusions you drew regarding the diet of Tel Hisban inhabitants in 14th century?
What's interesting is to compare what's before and what's after to really appreciate how rich the diet was in the 14th century. I didn't. My students took and processed and floated over 120 soil samples. I can't even tell you what a labor of love that was, and how time consuming and how frustrating all of that was. And then the floated soils got shipped off to the West Coast in the US for Alan Farahani to study. But what we're going to find, I'm really excited to see what the results are going to be, those laboratory results in the next year. What we were able to do is between the 2018 and the 2021 season is we're going to, on the basis of that botanical study, is to compare 13th and 14th, in particular, 13th and 14th century dietary practices and culinary traditions and cropping, to see what people are actually planting. If we were to talk about initial perceptions, I'd say this much, is that the 13th century seems to be pretty basic. Porridges, like we've learned about from Betty the Cooking Pot that we excavated in 2018, and very limited use of meats and fruits. In the 14th century, we've got nuts and a wide variety of fruits and a variety of different kinds of meats. We've got dried fish that is coming from really from probably the Red Sea, possibly the Jordan Valley too. We've got mutton, different cuts of sheep meat in the citadel and in the village. And so there's a distribution of meat there. Chickens, but this is very interesting. We know from textual sources that deal with primarily recipes, and these are Syrian recipes of the Mamluk and Ottoman period, that chickens are raised for their eggs to take the eggs to urban markets. And so we have pastries that have egg in them as an ingredient. Eating eggs is an urban culinary custom. And of course, eating chicken, what we see is that the more urban a place becomes, the more chicken becomes an really important part of the diet. And we see this at Hisban. We're seeing the raising of chickens, and we found eggshells. And so in other words, we're starting to see the consumption, eggshells from the cook pot, by the way. We're starting to see the consumption of eggs locally instead of just sending them to other markets. So to me, that's kind of a marker that by the middle of the 14th century, Hisban's not really a village in a culinary sense in a way. It really has become quite urban. And we're seeing that in the ceramic record, we're seeing that with glass. Overall consumption is that it has an urban feel, right? It's not a village diet anymore. Now, these are tentative understandings of changes in diet. What we're going to have to do is wait until we get the macrobotanical and the phytolith and starch results this year. What was exciting this year, you may remember when you visited the site, those farmhouses are beautifully stratified because they've got a series of one after another plastered floors. And these plaster floors are the stratigraphic separation between the 13th and the 14th century, really between the late Ayyubid and the Mamluk period. And so what we're going to be able to do is to compare the pottery between the two periods and the food between the two periods. And I suspect what we're going to see, and we have a hint of this, is that there is a distinct dietary difference between the two periods. Now, this is going to become a lot clearer, but again, these are kind of preliminary results that we're getting now. If we look at cookbooks, there is a boom in the interest in culinary practices among the ulama in the 14th and 15th centuries. And we have Egyptian and Syrian cooking books. Some of these are getting published and translated now so that more and more people can read them. I've been comparing them to, in Arabic form, the 16th century Syrian cookbooks. And the comparison between the 14th and the 16th century is quite interesting. So I think that this interest in culinary culture is a very relevant one, because even in its day, in its time, people living in Cairo and Damascus in the 14th century all of a sudden became interested in food. And people that weren't cooking were interested in how to cook. How do you make sense of that? People are learning to cook. Are these actual manuals?
Probably
or
manuals.
is this just,
Probably manuals.
Yeah, they could just, it's something that you put on your shelf. They could be encyclopedias. We're still not sure how they were used. But what's interesting is that there's a growing interest in what people eat. Now, what those cookbooks don't tell us is rural food practice. Only occasionally do they work any side references, but they'll say in the village, people eat like this. These cookbooks are urban. They describe an urban cuisine. But when we start to see elements of that cuisine, let's say in the archaeological record, we can say, you know, the cuisine is changing a little bit from what it used to be. But I think the 14th century is a very interesting period for just that reason, is that people become interested in aspects of urban culture, and that includes cooking too.
Do we have evidence of locally produced glassware and pottery in Tel Hisban? Or pottery and glassware were imported from other industrial centers?
Yeah, yes to both. So let's start off with the pottery. In 2018, we were fascinated to see an annex that had been built onto this one farmhouse cluster we've been focusing on, that has some wonderful subfloor drains and plastered basins and clumps of processed clay and tools that are used for working clay. So this is the closest we've gotten for identifying a space that's used for ceramic production. Now, on the basis of that processed clay and the tools, we're not talking about handmade pottery. We're talking about wheel-made pottery, and very nice wheel-made pottery. This is from a 14th century context. In previous season, we found firing tripods that were found in garbage heaps at other parts of the site in middens. So there must have been a kiln somewhere, but we found, and oh my heavens, this is about 10 years ago. In addition to tripods, there were wasters of pottery, but again, they were from midden contexts, not where they were used, not where they were fired, but thrown away in a building that wasn't being lived in anymore. This season, I was shocked at what we found. We found molds for making molded fineware, wheel-made fineware that we usually say is only made in Syria and Damascus. That's local. And in another building, we found a circular, what do you call it, wheel, the wheel platform that you turn, a turntable that you make wheel-made pottery on. So in other words, everything is sort of scattered and thrown away, but we do have that one space that seems to be devoted to at least the processing of clay. So yes, we have a local production. I have a graduate student, Salam Qasim, who is doing materials analysis for her dissertation, very good work, where she has identified local production of glazed wares through petrographic and chemical analysis. So yes, we do. Do we have imports? Oh yes, we've got some very fine imports. We have pseudo-celadons, identified those from Cairo, Egyptian production, some sgraffito wares that are Egyptian. Most of our imports are Damascene though, so these are Syrian, and that makes sense. The site's closer to Damascus than it is Egypt, and we have family connections between Hisban and Damascus in the 14th and 15th centuries, so that makes sense. Glass, Julian Henderson in the UK is a glass specialist, and he's been working on our glass. And he has a publication coming out right now that involves Hisban material in the Journal of Islamic Archaeology. The study that he's been doing has been interesting. He has identified wasters of glass and nuggets of glass for recycling for the Abbasid period. So we have early Islamic production of glass. As far as the later periods, that remains to be seen. He just finished doing some chemical analysis of lustered and enameled beautiful glass fragments that we found in 2018. And it should tell us whether it is Damascene, Cairene, or Hispani. So we wait.
Regarding the research, you told me that you have a group of young students, around 18 of them, and they're specialized in Islamic archaeology, in rural society, ceramics, landscape studies, art history. And are you planning to launch more projects and digging seasons, not only in Jordan, but in Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Egypt? It's very difficult to talk about Iraq and Syria because of the political situation and security situation there. But what are your plans with a group of students specialized in Islamic archaeology?
Well, my students are quite independent-minded, all right? So they follow my advice, but they also have minds of their own. And so they're doing their own projects.
Yeah.
One is doing fieldwork. One's doing fieldwork in Saudi Arabia. I've had PhD students doing fieldwork in Egypt. I have one that is working in with a French team in northern Iraq. And so they're doing fieldwork all over the place. Some in Palestine, some in Jordan, and it's very, very mixed. I'm going to continue to do the field work that I have at multiple sites throughout southern Bilad Sham, and we will continue that way and expand. But everybody is involved, almost everybody is involved in field work. And even our students who are art historians, many of them have done multiple seasons at Hisban in order to get that archaeological experience that simply enriches the work they do as art historians. And we certainly benefit by them being part of it too. So direction for the future, I'm getting some new students that hopefully in the fall, one is working in Egypt, another one again in northern Iraq. And I just think that as our numbers grow and our student body diversifies, it's going to be, we're going to be covering a larger Islamic world as a result. It really is an exciting place to work.
Yes, because we have so many sites in Jordan itself. We're talking about 27,000 well-documented sites and around 100,000 sites overall, plus sites in the region, namely Syria or Palestine, which are even bigger in number. But the problem is security and political instability in the region, plus, of course, the COVID-19. Hopefully the pandemic is going to to Seoul and cease after 2 years. Are you planning to come to Tel Hisban this year?
No, I've got to write. We have to write, we have to process. So no, I won't be doing field work. But all of our students right now, and the whole team needs to sit down and do our lab work and write. But we will be back. We'll be back after we get a little bit of this lab work done. And what you said about Jordan being rich for archaeology, it is. And if I were to take all of the projects that I'm doing and that my PhD students are doing, they span Jordan from the Syrian border down to Shobek Castle. Some of them are excavations, some of them are surveys. They're all wonderful projects. Some involve material analysis of things like ceramics. And one thing that I'm quite delighted about is that as large as our PhD program is, we now have groups of students that are working together. So now we've got a key group of Ottomanists, and we have this group that do Mamluk, and others that are doing, that are epigraphers, and others doing research on Islamization. So it's quite nice to see people collaborate and support one another in the research, particularly when they have common interests. And that's working very, very well here at our research unit.
Thank you so much for your time. If you want to add something, I'll be glad to listen to your input.
And thanks for coming to visit the site in October. Thanks for joining us. And
I was preparing to come in 2022. But it seems that you're not going to dig this year.
I'm not going to be coming into the field this year. We really need to. We've got to get the writing done. We've got to do the lab work, and that's critical. But I got to say that we are just so grateful that this dig season happened in October, and yeah, and it was we got accomplished everything that we needed to get accomplished to move on to the writing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll definitely keep in touch and collaborate regarding articles and regarding the podcast. If you have anything new or insightful, I'm glad to help you promote this work and promote Tel Hisban and the researchers who are involved with the project. Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll keep disseminating your knowledge and expertise. This is what media should do in general.
I like this venue, Saab, because it's a discussion. You know, we're talking back and forth, and it's very nice. I like that.
No, the podcast.
And you always ask the right questions.
A podcast in general is better than an article of 500 or 600 words. And when I prepare articles,